Thank you for taking the time to do this interview with us. I know you were one of his mentees, and so I think it's important that we get the story out, so, that we get the story about his career and his influence in surgery and in American academia. Okay, so we have Dr. Rob Nguyen. He's on the screen. He's the Cancer Center Director at Virginia Commonwealth University.
Mm-hmm. Hi, how you doing?
I'm doing well, man, and looking forward to working with you and hopefully working with you at the ACS.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. I know our time is short. So Dr. Frederick, Dr. Leffall had a tremendous impact on oncology. Would you mind relaying to us some of his most important contributions as you see them?
Sure. I think there are two things that come to mind. One is his impact on training. If you look at the time that he spent at Howard, he was on faculty for in excess of 60 years. And during that period of time between students and residents, the number of lives that he changed in terms of career trajectory, getting people interested in surgery, getting people interested in surgical oncology. And then outside of surgical oncology, I would also say he influenced a lot of other medical students who take care of cancer patients, and in some cases in an ancillary fashion, but they still use a lot of his teachings and his philosophy around obsessing about the patient, making the patient the center of our affection, and providing hope, which he defined as the anticipation of tomorrow. And so I think that that's a major influence. The second influence was when he became president of the American Cancer Society. As the first African American to do so, he had a very, at that time, heady agenda to bring a focus on closing and highlighting, I should say, and closing in that order, the disparities that African Americans and other underrepresented minorities were experiencing in terms of cancer outcomes. And I think that was a bold initiative in 1970 to put on the table, but it was the right initiative, and it was the initiative that I would say also led to lots of changes that would come all down through the years, and I think that impact of him setting that bold agenda then was important. So much so that I have a bust in my office that the American Cancer Society gave him at the end of his tenure, because I do feel that was one of his most pivotal contributions. And so he gave me that bust before his passing to ask me to keep it as well.
That's beautiful. So speaking of students, I was fortunate enough to be one of Dr. Leffall's students. You were class of 94, I was class of 95. And Dr. Leffall used to quote Dr. Charles Drew. And he said, "Excellence in performance transcends artificial barriers created by men."
Yeah.
So as his students, our quote from him is equanimity under duress. What does that mean to you?
Yeah. As a Charles Drew professor at surgery here at Howard now, both of those men are inextricably tied to a lot of what I think of in terms of philosophy. Equanimity under duress, I think I probably use it every day in terms of saying it to someone else. And I'm a board director in several public companies, and I say to the CEOs all the time that one of the lessons in surgery is equanimity under duress. But what it means is that when stuff is going wrong, everything is all over the place, you have to get quieter. And the way I explain it to medical students is that when the patient is bleeding, I don't get to throw instruments across the room and yell and scream and stomp my feet. As a matter of fact, if anything, the only thing that I get to do is to become more focused. And my description of that is that almost everything around me slows down, it gets quiet, and you get to focus in on it. And in my role as the university president, that happens all the time. Every crisis, when everybody wants to respond and have a knee-jerk reaction to kind of catch the latest news cycle, I tell the team the same thing. We need to slow ourselves down, make sure we are really dealing with the right problem and not just putting a Band-Aid on a wound that's probably 3 times the size of the Band-Aid. And so I think it's a very important adage that he left us with, and one that certainly has served me very well.
Okay. So how's Dr. Leffall's influence shaped you as a person, as a surgeon, and as a leader?
Yeah, in many ways, in a lot of ways, I would say he became a father to me. I didn't anticipate having such a close personal relationship, but that's what occurred. You know, I lost my own dad a month shy of my 3rd birthday, and so Dr. Leffall, in many ways, I think went above and beyond just being a mentor. That shaped me in terms of my own fatherhood. I would say today, the relationship I have with my 17-year-old son and 15-year-old daughter, I think comes from kind of that same attention to detail that he put into my relationship. We never started any conversation without him asking me how I was doing, how was the family doing, et cetera. It doesn't matter what the nature of the conversation was, the gravity of what we were going to discuss, it always started that way. And so a few weeks ago, I had the opportunity, probably now 2 months ago, I had the opportunity to take my 2 kids to the operating room to watch me operate. And if I do nothing else in my career, that certainly was the zenith. To have them see me in what I think is the most sacred space that I've been able to enter, and to see them behind their mask get the same rush of adrenaline that I got the first time I was in that space was an incredible feeling. My son, came up to me after and said, I can't explain it, Dad, but I just felt like this rush of excitement when you made that incision. And, that's not what you're expecting your kids to think in that situation. I'm just hoping they don't faint. And the fact that he got that sense of exhilaration says a lot. Right. I think the other thing that he did was, in terms of his influence on me personally, was leading by example. So I still operate to this day. I'm probably the only university president in America who does that now. And I don't do it simply because I can. I do it because I must. The ability to pass on what I've learned to another generation is important. And that's why he did it. And he did it and led by example. And so that's important. When you lead a faculty as diverse as this one is, it has to be clear that you have to lead from the front and lead by example at times. This evening, I'll teach a course in the School of Education. And when I say teach a course, I'm not a guest lecturer. It's my course for the whole semester. And so, I carry my own load to make sure that everybody else, and I think that was one of the things that he left with me as well on a personal note, that you have to lead by example as well. And so, there are other very personal things in terms of how he carried himself and, little things that he would do. I like to call secrets of the trade that I still do to this day. And they bode well, for navigating life in general. And I think that those are some of the things that I also appreciate that my close relationship with me afforded me the opportunity to learn.
So, it's interesting, and I'm sure this is going to be a little off script, but the morning after Dr. Leffall passed, you ran a 5K in all black in recognition of his influence on life. So to me, that was a big statement, Wayne. That was a big statement about all the impacts that he's had on you, his students, his residents, and the world. So thank you for that.
I appreciate it.
So if Dr. Leffall were here today, what advice do you think he would give us as we address structural racism, the COVID epidemic, the unmasking of the unequal policing of African-American men and women?
Yeah. I think there are 2 things that he was telling us about all along that to this day apply. One was the Charles Drew quote that you used earlier: excellence of performance transcends all artificial barriers created by man. And his point there was not that we ignore the oppression and the things that must be changed, but that while we do that, we also must be excellent. So as we occupy the spaces that we rightfully should be in, that people cannot question us being there when we get there, that we don't then get there and then start thinking of preparing ourselves appropriately, but that we perform in an excellent way, that when we're there, the only thing people could say is, geez, why do we keep them out of here for so long? That was a mistake. And whether they acknowledge it in word or in deed, they will acknowledge it. And I think that he would still do that. I think the other thing that he would say as well is that we have to amplify each other's humanity, that ultimately at the end of the day, that is what a lot of these things are about. Not just respecting or acknowledging each other's humanity, but amplifying each other's humanity. And that's a big difference. And I think he made a point about that. The dignity with which he spoke about treating patients and affording them the fullness of their humanity, I think is what he would have told us today would bode well for us. And that is that we should be amplifying each other's humanity, not just simply acknowledging it. And that means that you have to go the extra step, not just to provide opportunity, but to also make sure the support systems are there. And as you said, as you take down systemic racism, you've got to replace it with something else. And what we have to replace it with is good infrastructure and support for the people who've been oppressed. And I think that that's what he would have been advocating for us to be focused on.
I have a follow-up question on that.
Sure.
Did he ever tell you any of the stories about how he started and any of the challenges he had? And in fact, I'm asking specifically because you may know the story with the relationship with him and Dr. Walter Lawrence, who also just passed, first cancer center director at VCU Massey. So any stories that he actually, that you remember him telling about that time?
There are two stories in particular that I think are pertinent to this topic, and especially that issue about people amplifying his own humanity. He graduated from what was then called Florida A&M College at the age of 18 with 1B on his transcript. And like most African-American students, not just at that time, but even today, didn't take standardized tests well. And so he did not get into any of the medical schools that he could apply to. And at that time, I believe there were only 2 medical schools he could apply to, Harry and Howard. He didn't get into either one. That resulted in his university president, President Green, I believe, at the time, petitioning Mordecai Wyatt Johnson to admit him and a fellow student into Howard's med school. The other student had straight A's. And so sure enough, the dean of the med school admitted both of them, and he would go on to graduate number 1 in his class. So he often talked about the fact that that grace that his university president afforded him by making a personal petition on his behalf to get him into medical school, was something else. While he was in medical school, his dad would die unexpectedly. And while he was waiting tables in the Northeast in the summer, he came across a gentleman and kind of just told the gentleman, he had developed a relationship for being there a couple of summers with that gentleman, and he would write that gentleman a letter at the beginning of the semester and, explain to him that his father died and that he would, like to borrow, I think at that time was $500. And the guy wrote him back with a check because he was so impressed with Dr. Leffall waiting tables, and told him, you don't have to pay me back, just pay it forward. And he would always recall that story. And so his generosity himself and his philanthropy did that. And then on the issue of Walter Lawrence, you talk about not just equanimity under duress, but also, I would say, putting yourself in an uncomfortable position. And the story there, as he had told it to me, was that Walter Lawrence advocated for him to be admitted to the Southern Surgical. They would refuse to admit him, and Walter Lawrence got up in that meeting and said, if Dr. Leffall is not qualified to be a part of this organization, then I'm not qualified to be a part of this organization. And I believe in the history of the Southern Surgical, he's the only person who ever withdrew from the Southern Surgical. And because he withdrew and because of the way their bylaws were written, I believe Walter Lawrence would go to his grave, never being a general member of that body. But I believe they readmitted him as an honorary member at some point in his career. So when he spoke of what Walter Lawrence did on his behalf in terms of his advocacy for him, he spoke about the fact that there are other people who will amplify your humanity, who will be more than just allies. And I think Walter Lawrence's example is exactly that. He didn't just advocate for Dr. Leffall. He made a personal career sacrifice among colleagues who could impact his career at a time that he was vulnerable, but felt it was the right thing to do. And so he had a great deal of respect for Walter Lawrence for doing that.
So the interesting thing about Dr. Lawrence is I actually met him at a Southern Surgical Association meeting in the Homestead. And I thanked him for that, not because he had to do it, but because he stood up for my hero, right? And because of Dr. Leffall, we are able to transcend the heights that we're able to in surgery. So that was a pivotal moment. And again, Dr. Lawrence needs to be highly, highly commended for his actions.
I absolutely agree. And it's I think the other thing I would mention, especially as you talk about Dr. Leffall and Dr. Lawrence, Dr. Leffall was always quick to highlight people like Dr. Lawrence, which I think is another personality trait that he had that was great, because he always believed in lifting up others. You lift up yourself as well. And so people like Dr. Lawrence don't often get, I think, the recognition they deserve for taking those types of stances that if more people in our society did, we'd probably have a much more complete union.
Great.
One quick question was, so if Dr. Leffall were here today, what role would he see the cancer centers within HBCUs playing within the 21st century?
Yeah, he would be very sensitive about the fact that the disparities that exist, that we're not closing those gaps quickly enough. I think today in particular, he'd be even more acutely concerned that after the pandemic, as we've had a decrease in screening, as we've shut down access even further, that the most vulnerable are going to come out of this in a much worse position. And some of the gains that we've made on life expectancy are going to slip away. So I think that he would be sounding the alarm that we really needed to start investing in those and making sure that we were training the next generation who would be willing to take care of folks in those communities. I think the next 5 years, cancer outcomes in African Americans could be disastrous as a result of the pandemic and its impact. Everything from the economic impact to the fact that we decrease screening in those neighborhoods, et cetera. And so I think now is the time to sound the alarm. I think 5 years from now, when we look up, we could be in a very difficult place.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Frederick. Are there any parting words that you'd like to leave us with?
No, thanks for doing this. I appreciate it. And so thanks for thinking of me. Appreciate it very much.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we think about Dr. Leffall's students, and here you are as the president of Howard University. I mean, you don't live the legacy out much bigger than that, right? So again,
well, he's the one thing that I do cherish is the fact that he was so proud of that fact. As he would say, I trained a university president, so he loved that.
So I can do have one more question on that though. So when you think of, we talk about Dr. Leffall as a surgeon, what was his greatest innovation and what was his greatest impact on the field?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to mention something that I've probably never mentioned publicly. Long before we did timeout and it was written about and adopted and tested, he actually did timeout, and I'm sure John may remember this, but if you went to the operating room with him to do a breast case, even as a student, he would ask the patient in front of you, which breast are we operating on today, Ms. Smith? And she would say left. And he would, even have her raise her left arm. And then he would look around the room and say, which breast are we operating on? He would put the films up and look at it. And before we started, he would make everybody stop and acknowledge that we were operating on the left breast.
Yeah.
And years later, when timeout came about, I would chuckle to myself that he could have totally, this could have been the Leffall timeout, because but I mention that again because I think he was such a thoughtful, methodical human being in terms of what he did. And so the impact I think that he had was that issue of always being prepared, about always giving yourself, about always being excellent in every single moment, that there wasn't an opportunity to necessarily let your guard down when it came to giving the best because somebody's life mattered. And I think the humanity and dignity with which he went to those patients treated with, I think was the biggest impact. And like I said, it doesn't matter what field you went into, as long as you were a medical student, I think you got that. So everything from turning in your case report and having him correct the spelling. I turned in my case report and got 1 point taken off because I missed out an F in Leffall on the cover sheet. And I was amazed that he paid that much attention. I think I still have that paper at home. And I used to tell him that story repeatedly. He would chuckle at it. He was a very humble man too. John's classmate, I think he may have been a year after you, Tony Rankin, who's an orthopedic surgeon, Mark Rankin.
Yes,
his father was Tony Rankin. Mark Rankin was at a party at the Epps' house and fell into a pool when he was around 5 or 6. So bigger kids in the pool jumped in and started to drown. Dr. Leffall in a 3-piece suit jumped in and pulled him out. Mark Rankin told me that story. I got goosebumps. And so I couldn't wait for my Monday morning meeting with Dr. Leffall. And I run in there and I say, listen, I saw Mark Rankin this week and he told me the story and I tell him the whole story. And the whole time he's looking at me totally deadpan. And as soon as I'm done, he says, yep, that's exactly what happened. There's no yeast in that story. So how are you and your family doing? He did not add he didn't add a single word to the story. He didn't tell me how much the suit cost. I mean, nothing else that the average human being would have described, the shoes they were wearing. He just moved on to the next thing. And so again, that humility just spoke volumes about who he was.
I like it. There was no yeast in that story. I like it.
That's right.
You think his biggest impact on the field?
I think on the field, really focusing on the cancer disparities. I think he was big about that, both in direct ways in terms of how he treated patients, the things he wrote about, but also when you look at some of the major things, I believe, when you look at him appearing on primetime TV to talk about colonoscopy and its impact in colorectal cancer, to see a Black man as an expert in the field at that time, at that day and age, highlighted many things about cancer care. It highlighted that there weren't enough African Americans involved. It highlighted that, he was one of the most talented in the country at providing care for those patients. And, it highlighted the issue at hand. I mean, his words about the issue about screening were on point. And so, that wasn't the typical thing that somebody would do that would impact the field, but I think it had a massive impact, in terms of how the country viewed an issue like that. And colorectal cancer got a lot of attention around that issue as well.
Thank you. John?
This is it. That is it. Thank you so much, Wayne, for taking the time.
All right, no problem.
Good to see you.
You guys take care, stay safe.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
All right.